Hi and welcome to the channel. I am in the man cave again just to vary things up a little bit, and it's time to talk about another bunch of Hammer horror films. Our favourite old-time movie studio has a lot more to give for this channel. So this time around I'm going to do the Mummy movies that Hammer produced between 1959 and 1971. There are 4 of them. 3 of them have mummies in them, the 4th doesn't. But they're all kind of interesting, though. I think the top and the bottom are the most interesting, and the 2 in the middle are a little bit less so. But let's get started anyway with the 1959, The Mummy. So in 1959, Hammer took the reins and decided to make a mummy movie. There were other ones. There were Aztec mummies. There were all sorts of mummies in cinema, but Hammer, which had up until the time it started doing the Dracula films, and the Mummy films and the Frankenstein films, it was seen more as a crime kind of studio. It did comedies as well. It was kind of working class in the best possible way. But in 1959, after the success of their Dracula and Frankenstein, they hit the Mummy, and they hit it hard. They had a script by Jimmy Sangster. They had Terence Fisher directing it, Christopher Lee starring as Kharis, the Mummy, and Peter Cushing as John Banning, the guy who goes up against the Mummy. So you've got the team back together from the Dracula movie. They know what they're doing, and they did it bloody well. There's a lot of secret sources in this one. And I'll talk about secret sources in a lot of videos, I know. But the secret sources in this one are, first off, Peter Cushing's wonderful ability to make really silly dialogue sound important. And he gets a lot of that in this movie, and he takes it so seriously. His kind of deep, grounded sincerity while talking about absurd things really gives us a verisimilitude that we wouldn't have had otherwise, and I like that.
She was bound for Amtak, the reputed birthplace of her god. The great procession traveled for 3 months when the princess was stricken with a sickness.
The other secret source that I've got is Christopher Lee as Kharis and also as the Mummy. Now, there are some flashback scenes 4,000 years ago when Kharis decides he's going to resurrect the Egyptian princess whom he loves, even though he's not supposed to because he's a high priest, and gets caught trying to do that with the Scroll of Life and ends up with his tongue plucked out and being mummified alive to stand guard forever over the woman he loved. So he's really good in those scenes, plus he's good as the Mummy. Even with the heavy makeup on, Christopher Lee acts through the makeup. And I think the makeup application in the 1959 The Mummy is better than the other 2 films by about a mile. It really allows him to emote through the makeup. The look of him with his skinny frame and being so tall, and the stilted walk, which was due to a couple of things. Christopher Lee bashed himself to hell making this movie. There was a door he bashes through in the film, which wasn't supposed to be latched, but was, and he ended up dislocating his shoulder. He did his back in picking up Yvonne Furneaux, who plays the female reincarnation of his loved one. So he did his back in as well. He also bashed his legs around a lot on some submerged pipes that were in the swamp set that he walks around in during the movie. By the way, the sets for the swamp and a few other things were leftover sets from a previous Hammer movie called Yesterday's Enemy. And so they reused them for this one because Hammer was always good at recycling things from previous movies. And so there were submerged pipes which make that bubbling you get in swamps and things in old movies. And nobody told him where the pipes were, so he bashed his legs around a lot. Christopher Lee was in a lot of pain making this movie, but ultimately it was worth it. You've got Yvonne Furneaux playing the love interest for Peter Cushing's character, plus the object of Kharis's attention. Next movie she made after this one, La Dolce Vita, for Federico Fellini. One of the great movies of all time is the movie she made after The Mummy. So you never know what your next gig is going to be, whatever you're doing. So keep that in mind if you're changing jobs. The supporting cast is pretty good. You've got Felix Aylmer and Raymond Huntley playing the older archaeologists who go to open the tomb of the princess. Felix Aylmer did another gig that was really interesting a couple of years later for Hammer, where he played the old pedophile in Don't Take Candy from a Stranger, which is a really interesting black and white Hammer film that I've talked about once or twice on the channel before. We also get an actor called George Pastel playing Mehmet Bey, the guy who unleashes the mummy on the people who stole the artifacts. And George Pastel played a lot of Middle Eastern and Southern Asian characters in British films in the 50s and 60s. Wasn't really from the Middle East particularly. He was a Cypriot. He was from Cyprus, which is a little to the left of the Middle East. But he ended up playing Indian characters. He ended up playing Middle Eastern characters. And he does a pretty good job in this one. His character is intelligent, literate. He's not looked down upon by the other characters, even though he's playing a non-white character, which is kind of rare for that era of filmmaking. And he gets to wear a fez. So there's no downside for him on this.
You remove the remains of the long-dead kings and send them to places like the British Museum, where thousands of people can stare at them. Does this not trouble you at times? Your conscience, perhaps?
No, it's my job.
He's really good at giving us that little bit of exoticism that is necessary when you're having a very much a white Anglo-Saxon kind of movie. Even though, of course, the extras playing the Nubian slaves in the ancient Egyptian scenes were people of colour. They never really got any agency and were just there as extras. Film studios in London used to clean out restaurants of waiters and kitchen staff to get a certain look for their movies. Hammer was renowned for this. If they had a movie set in East Asia, they'd empty out all the Chinese restaurants. If they needed Indian people, they'd empty out the Indian restaurants. If they need Middle Eastern looking people, they'd empty out the Turkish restaurants. So Hammer ended up being a pretty good side hustle for a whole bunch of hospitality staff in London in the 50s and 60s. The action scenes are pretty good as well. There's a little bit of blood and gore, which is always welcome in a Hammer film. And there's something really satisfying about seeing Peter Cushing blasting Christopher Lee with a shotgun and then stabbing him with a spear. And the climax is kind of interesting too, in the swamp, where Carice carries Yvonne Furneaux and into the swamp, and Peter Cushing tells her what to do so the cops can blast the shit out of the mummy. It works because there's a clean through line. There aren't too many secondary characters to muddy things up. We know who everybody is, what they're doing. There's a certain vulnerability to the hero as well. He had a broken leg at the time the tomb was opened, so he didn't go in and defile the tomb, which is kind of good for him. He's already at a disadvantage because he has a limp and he has a bum leg. And then he's going up against an implacable and undead creature. Kind of works. It intensifies that drama really nicely. And it's a solid, honest Hammer film. It may well be one of the best. And I enjoyed watching that one a lot. So after watching it, I zip panned to 1964 for The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, the second of Hammer's mummy movies, which reused a whole bunch of the Egyptian props from the first one. And I kind of like the fact they recycled them. And if you watch the movies back to back, you can kind of go, oh yeah, that's that thing Christopher Lee was holding up 4,000 years ago. You can kind of do that with a lot of the props there. And that makes it a little bit more fun. Though this is definitely one of the lesser of the four. The stars of the movie are Terence Morgan, Ronald Howard, not the Ronald Howard who was in Happy Days and the Andy Griffith Show and directed Apollo 13. This one was the son of Leslie Howard, the actor before World War II who died during World War II. He had a bit of a career playing stiff upper-class Englishman, which he does in this one as well. And the love interest is played by a woman called Jean Roland, who played a lot of French characters in the roles she had in movies and TV in England, but she was actually Burmese. This movie was written and directed by Michael Carreras, who was mostly a producer for Hammer. And looking through the oeuvre of Mr. Carreras as a director and as a writer, he was much better as a producer. I think that he really didn't have the structure of scripts done very well, and his direction was kind of ordinary, let's say. You have the usual thing where a bunch of archaeologists take some artifacts away from a tomb, including a mummy, and take them to London, but they kind of put a slight spin on this one. Because the guy who ends up getting the artifacts and the mummy to display is an American showman played by Fred Clark. Now, Fred Clark we know mostly for comedies and things, very well-known face. He's not the first person you really think of when you think Hammer horror films. And Fred Clark, playing this showman called Alexander King, has a kind of shift in the way he acts during the movie. I don't know whether he got notes, but at the start of the movie, he's playing the character really large, like it's for a small screen sitcom.
You hear that? You must be out of your mind. Now, I'm going to roadshow this mummy throughout the world. That way we'll make 700,000 pounds.
You can't, sir.
What do you mean, can't? Don't tell me I can't.
And then as we get to the last few scenes his character appears in, he actually shows his chops as a character actor. He does a big display for the press on the Egyptian artifacts and mummy he's going to be displaying. And he's really good in that. He's riveting in that, in fact. And there's a scene towards the end where he meets up with a sex worker on the streets and gives her some money even though he's not interested. And you kind of get the idea that this over-the-top, brash American chancer is actually a reasonable person. He gives a little bit of character there, and I like that. I like the fact that even though he started out playing the way he usually plays in movies and TV series, he actually took the opportunity to give his character a bit more depth, and I like that. I like the fact that he could make that shift. Now, between the three protagonists, there's a love triangle, of course. On the way back to England with the artifacts, aboard the ship, they meet a very wealthy Englishman, played by Terence Morgan. His name's Adam Beecham, and he offers them to let them stay in his house in Regent's Park because they were looking for digs when they got to London. And there's the start of a love triangle between the three characters, which makes things slightly more interesting, even though Terence Morgan and Ronald Howard are not the most interesting actors in the world. A love triangle will always spice up a movie. We get George Pastel again, playing the guy who resurrects the mummy. So the movie plays along kind of ordinary because Michael Carreras isn't that gifted when it comes to scripting or direction. But then you get a third act twist in one of the characters, which is a little bit WTF, but has the potential to make it more interesting had it been foreshadowed earlier in the script, which it wasn't. So you get a big climax in the sewers underneath London, which are not filmed anywhere near as interesting as the sewers of Vienna in The Third Man. For me, this one's equal third in the four movies. I think that the two in the middle, as I said, are a bit less than they should be. And that brings us to 1967 and The Mummie's Shroud. The movie was co-written and directed by John Gilling, who's usually pretty reliable in Hammer, but in this one, I don't really think so. And one of the problems with the script is, I checked it up on Wikipedia, you've got about 18 characters running around in this Hammer horror film. And about 6 or 7 of them are redundant. There are other characters in the movie that could take that role and take on the narrative burden that these extra characters have. And it's a dog's breakfast. It's mangled, it's mixed up, it's silly. Even though it does have some good people in the cast, and the two most valuable people, actually 3 most valuable people in the cast. First off, Andre Morel, and I love Andre Morel in a Hammer film. He plays Sir Basil Walden, an archaeologist who goes to Egypt and gets lost with his team, and as he's lost, he finds the lost tomb of a boy pharaoh whose backstory we get at the start of the film before the credits roll. And the info dump at the start of the film really weighs things down. We get the backstory, we get leftover props from the first Mummy movie in 1959. You do, however, get to see Dickie Owen playing Prem. Now, Dickie Owen is the actor who played the mummy in the second Mummy movie that I just talked about. But in this one, he plays the guy who becomes the mummy and doesn't play the mummy himself. And if that's complicated, I'm sorry. So we get all of that stuff. We find the history of this boy pharaoh, why he has to leave the Nile and go out into the desert, how his father was betrayed by his father's brother, all that kind of backstory stuff. So you get a lot of that kind of heavy exposition at the start. And then you get Andre Morel and his team getting lost in the desert. He gets bitten by a snake and is quite unwell. Meanwhile, they then cut to a millionaire who's financed the expedition for reasons of his own, who's in Egypt and in Cairo with his wife, played by Elizabeth Sellers, who's really good in a fairly small and fairly thankless role. I like her in this film. And he's sending out 3 different search teams to find the team that's lost in the desert. He's engaging the press. He's got a fixer who helps him with things in Egypt. played by the wonderful Michael Ripper, who was in the other two movies that I've already mentioned, but in very, very minor roles. But in this one, he plays a character called Longbarrow, who's a kind of meek, mild, obsequious character with Coke bottle glasses, and is very much under the thumb of this American millionaire played by John Phillips, who is just a pain in the ass all the way around. And when he dies, I'm happy. You got Michael Ripper in a much longer role, and a sympathetic role, than he usually got in Hammer horror films, and I really liked that part of it. Now, as with the last movie, the mummy makeup isn't very good. It's really, there's a bit where it opens its eyes and there's dust coming out from around these eyeballs they've got stuck in a mask. The mummy suits and the mummy makeup in the middle two movies are pretty ordinary, really. They don't work. They're almost an afterthought for the production, which is a bit of a shame. And that's disappointing, because one of the strengths of the 1959 Mummy was the fact that you could see Christopher Lee's eyes through the makeup. But in The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb and the Mummy's Shroud, you can hardly see the eyes of the actors, and they've got no chance at all to kind of emote or give us anything through that heavy makeup. They were played by stuntmen, so in fact the guy who played the mummy in this one is a guy called Eddie Powell, who was actually Christopher Lee's stunt double with Hammer. And he moves around pretty well, but you can't see anything about the facial features of the character. And I think that given that he's, the character he's playing is in the title of the movie, it's a bit of a loss. In this one, we get the characters controlling the mummy, played by Roger Delgado, an actor of Spanish descent, who played the Master in early Doctor Who series, so all the fanboys love him. Playing a Bedouin who is in league with a fortune teller played by Catherine Lacey, an old lady fortune teller played by Catherine Lacey. Catherine Lacey was the old lady who, along with Boris Karloff, was in The Sorcerers in the 1960s, where they telepathically put themselves into the body of younger people. She's that character, actress, and she's really good in it as well. And Roger Delgado isn't particularly good. He's playing a cliched, kind of slightly brown-faced Arabic character. The way they resurrect the mummy is they have to be holding the shroud of the boy Pharaoh, and they have to chant the sacred oath to resurrect the mummy. There's also a sacred oath to kill the mummy, which gets used at the end. Really badly structured movie. The budget is probably the least of the four movies, and it shows. The sets are smaller. Even though there are a lot of actors on screen, there's really not a consistent structure to the film, and the direction is kind of lackluster, which is a little bit of a shame. It's packed full of stuff, but none of it's nutritious. So I didn't like that one. They're the two weak ones, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb and the Mummy's Shroud. I had great hopes for the Mummy's Shroud. I hadn't seen those two before because it had Andre Morell in it, but they get rid of him fairly quickly, and that cheesed me off no end. So that one was a disappointment. I was kind of dreading going to the last movie, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, from 1971, directed by Seth Holt, starring Valerie Leon, James Villiers, Andrew Keir from Quatermass and the Pit. And people turn up like James Cousins turns up, Aubrey Morris turns up playing a doctor. In fact, the doctor who delivered the Valerie Leon character into the world. And therein lies the story. 1971, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. They have a 6-week shoot for the film. In the 5th week, they're on set. Seth Holt is directing Aubrey Morris in one of the scenes in the clinic where the doctor works. He drops dead in Aubrey Morris's arms of a heart attack. And so Michael Carreras, the producer, steps in and shoots the last week of the film, which is mostly the stuff that appears in the clinic scenes, where there's a clinic where George Coulouris, playing one of the people who goes to the tomb, because there's always a tomb of these things, lives and is basically in a cell in a very well-equipped mental asylum. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This one doesn't have a mummy in it. What it has instead is an evil Egyptian priestess called Terra, played by Valerie Leon. Now, it's not her voice in the movie. Her voice is dubbed by another actress. But it's definitely her in there. Statuesque, beautiful woman, lovely blue eyes. And she was quite buxom, so there's a lot of male gaze about her.
Busty substances.
Which is very 1971. Valerie Leon wouldn't do nude scenes. There's a scene where she's naked from behind. Could have been a body double, might not have been. But she kind of refused to do nude scenes. And she said that really impeded her career with Hammer and other studios. But props to her for standing up for her standards. The script on this one is pretty good. It's by a guy called Christopher Wickham. I'm just going to read some of the movies he did the script for. The Oblong Box, Scream and Scream Again, Cry of the Banshee, a movie called Venom from the 1970s, which is really good. Demons of the Mind, and To the Devil a Daughter. So he did a lot of work for Hammer. And also Amicus too, because Scream and Scream Again is an Amicus movie, and it is really wild as well. It was actually based on a Bram Stoker novel called Jewel of the Seven Stars. And it stays more or less true to the actual novel, as much as you can when you're updating a novel 70 years into the future, which is what they did. They made it a contemporary story. Andrew Keir plays a guy called Julian Fuchs, who's one of 5 people who raised the tomb of the ancient evil priestess Terra. And they find her in a sarcophagus, and she's perfectly preserved. Apart from the fact that thousands of years ago, the people who poisoned her and put her in the coffin, they actually poisoned her through dripping poison into her nostril. And I'm not kidding. They cut off her right hand. And there's a great scene in the flashbacks where the hand itself is thrown to the jackals. And it kills the jackals and comes back into her tomb. And kills all of the guys who sealed Terra in her tomb, and then gets back into the tomb somehow. So that's kind of cool. I like that. I like that lateral thinking on there, and it may well have been based on the novel, but they portray it really interestingly. The main villain in this is a character called Corbeck, played wonderfully by James Villiers, who wants to resurrect Terra and wants to help her for reasons, I suppose. Now, the interesting thing is that the moment that the team of archaeologists broke into the Tomb of Terror and saw her, Andrew Keir's Julian Fuchs' wife went into labour in London. And at the same time they opened the tomb, she gave birth to a daughter, Margaret, again played by Valerie Leon. The baby dies for a moment, and then there's a heartbeat again. Dr. Putnam, played by Aubrey Morris, delivered the baby and appears later in the film as an older character. And so she is psychically linked to and looks exactly like Terra. She's a modern woman in 1971. She's got a boyfriend who's a bit of an asshole, really, played by an actor called Mark Edwards. And his character name, you're going to love this, is Todd Browning. Yeah, the guy who directed Freaks. So there's a little bit of a reference there that Christopher Wickham threw into the script as an Easter egg for people. You get some other actors in there. George Coulouris is really good in his role as the guy who's been driven insane because he has one of the artifacts that Terra needs to come back to life. Because all of the 5 nicked something from the tomb. And we also get the weirdness of the fact that Julian Fuchs has a tomb built in the basement of his house, which has been there for Margaret's entire life, which has the body of Terra perfectly preserved and wearing some kind of interesting burlesque gear, and never told his daughter. He just told his daughter, don't go in the basement. Now, if I was a kid, I would go in the basement if somebody told me not to, but apparently she didn't. And so you get the whole thing where the spirit of Terra comes back to life because Margaret's now old enough to be possessed by the spirit of her, and she goes after the artifacts and kills the people who raided her tomb. The direction on this is the best of any of the 4 movies, to be honest with you. Seth Holt's direction in the scenes he directed was great. There's a really nice one where Margaret's investigating the basement, and we see her in slow motion with her hair blowing, and it really does add an atmosphere. You can see Seth Holt trying something different to convey what he wants to convey in those scenes. And for me, this one works the best of the four, and I'm kind of dithering whether to say that because I know The Mummy from 1959 is so great. But there's some really interesting stuff in Blood from the Mummy's Tomb that lifts it to kind of, let's just say, equal to The Mummy. And I like it a lot. It's really well shot. The acting is great. You've got a whole bunch of character actors, and James Villiers was great at playing villains. Andrew Keir gets his to look really concerned and frail because his character has a stroke halfway through the film. What is it with older character actors that I like from Hammer? In mummy movies, they always get debilitated for some reason. Really hate that. The ending of it's nicely ambiguous as well. I like the ending of the film. I think it's based on the novel, though I'm not entirely sure. But for me, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb is worth checking out. I've got a Blu-ray copy of it, and I really enjoyed watching that. And it's one of those kind of second-tier Hammer movies that, while it's not as wonderful as some of the top-tier stuff, is still really entertaining and really different. And because it's got such a really well-chosen cast of character actors, for me it works really well. So they're the 4 Hammer mummy movies. I was really worried in the middle there when I watched the middle 2, because they were, for me, less than wonderful. But the 4th one really redeemed it, so I got really happy at the front, really happy at the end, kind of meh in the middle. Give it a go. Watch the 4 movies, let me know what you thought. So that's it this time around. Thank you very much for watching. As always, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what you thought, hit the notification bell. You can also support the channel financially by going to patreon.com/paleocinema and donating a little money. So anyway, look after yourselves, play safe, enjoy life. It's becoming spring in the Northern Hemisphere, it's becoming autumn here. Don't like autumn, don't like winter, but I'm going to have to bear it. Watch some good mummy movies, watch some bad mummy movies, watch some Hammer mummy movies, and I'll catch you next time.